Truth be told, friends, it's been a bumper month for console manufacturers attempting to torpedo any goodwill they have with their fans. But on today's episode of By Design, we're going to focus down on one of those stories, the story of Helldivers 2.
A fantastic breakthrough success story which armed millions of players with the power of managed democracy, and then watched in horror as they pointed those weapons directly at the Steam review score the second the social contract between them and the developers had been broken.
So what exactly happened with Helldivers 2? Why did Sony make the decisions they made? And what does this all tell us about the powers that players have? Or more accurately, the power they don't? Let's jump in.
So, Helldivers 2 comes out on February 8th, and pretty much right away people are singing its praises. The original Helldivers was a fun game, but incredibly simplistic by the watermark set by its sequel. Helldivers was a top-down co-op twin-stick shooter, where you and 3 other friends defended Super-Earth from hordes of incoming alien foes. The studio that created it, Arrowhead, was founded in 2008 in the incredibly remote North Swedish town of Skellefteå. The first game they made was Magica, a top-down co-op game where you and up to 3 other friends used Norse magic to fuck up elves and stuff. The studio relocated to Stockholm after that game, and it was here that they were responsible for the 2015 return of Gauntlet. It's a top-down co-op game where you and up to 3 other friends battle waves of fantasy baddies. So they had their box, isometric co-op games, and all things considered they were pretty good at them, but perhaps the market was limited, or the expectations of players had changed. Co-op third-person shooters were on the rise as many larger studios were pumping money into live game AAA shooters like Destiny, Anthem, and Warframe. So the team at Arrowhead decided to broaden on their core competencies, take the world, factions, and some mechanics from their 2015 Helldivers game and expand it into a third-person online shooter with practically every aspect of the game improved. Where games like Destiny and Anthem would have to build an entirely new world to play inside of, Arrowhead already had that world. They had a good foundation, which means they were able to dedicate more development time to answering fundamental design and technology questions, which is just as well because during development, the third-party engine they were using was discontinued.
When Helldivers 2 came out, it was warmly received. It was hardly the second coming of Space Nazi Christ, but it did do something that a lot of live services games don't really do. It respected the player's time and their wallet.
First off, Helldivers 2 was launched at $29.99, a very reasonable price considering it's an online game which does have some microtransactions. Secondly, while the game has those microtransactions, the core progression of the title doesn't feel artificially slowed down to accommodate some pay-to-win scam, and the game has a battle pass that never expires. For players, this was almost like jumping from toxic relationship to toxic relationship before eventually finding a partner who cares about your well-being. Well, to a certain extent. But Helldiver 2's narrative and themes also played into this sense of unity, with Super-Earth's satirical fascism turned up to Starship Trooper levels. Players were spreading managed democracy throughout the cosmos like never before. The studio's community team also did a fantastic job of leaning into the memes, with community updates often mirroring the satire of the game, encouraging some players to roleplay. As a result, early games of Helldivers 2 I had with randoms were oddly cooperative. The nature of the game is fairly chaotic, with fights often in open-air environments and friendly fire turned on. The ability to respawn quickly with minimal costs also helps, and the sheer ridiculousness of some of the encounters meant that losing in Helldivers 2 was often still fun. In the days following its launch, Helldivers 2 was everywhere, being played by everyone. It broke through 1 million combined PC and PlayStation sales in under 72 hours. By now it's likely sold a dozen or so million, and arguably more important than that, the game had massive amounts of goodwill from players, something that almost certainly resulted in players playing more, telling their friends about it, and using it as their new favorite co-op shooter.
So if you'd have told me that some sort of policy would come in that would jeopardize all of the goodwill Helldivers 2 had built up with its community, I'm not sure I would have believed you.
On April 3rd, Sony announced that all Helldivers 2 players would be required to log into a PlayStation Network account if they wanted to continue playing the game. This was originally planned to be the case at launch. Screenshots from 4 months before the release show that PSN was a requirement given the game's use of crossplay. So Sony's angle was that the initial launch window was a grace period that was now to end, meaning all new and existing players on PC would be required to create and/or link a PSN account. It's fair to say that most players never realized this, and even if they did, it seems like a heavy-handed requirement to suddenly drop on millions of players who have been helping spread the word about this game, players who have spent millions of hours sacrificing themselves to stop armies of bugs and robots. How the hell do you beat the robots? Unsurprising to anyone not working at Sony, this was met by a wave of anger and protests by the player base, who immediately used their experience in spreading managed democracy to downvote Helldivers 2's Steam reviews into oblivion. Quick sidebar, it's hard to tell why Sony wanted to implement this. There may be some genuine engineering reason that means having players on the same network makes it all a lot more manageable. It is, after all, a cross-play title for the PC and PS5. This is pretty common. But some folks posited that Sony wanted to gather all of this data so they could sell it to information brokers. But I don't know, that seems pretty small fry for a corporation as large as Sony. You could argue that this was a cheap way of pumping their PSN numbers, and to strengthen the platform for what is likely to be more PlayStation games coming to Steam. But another reason given was that it had something to do with anti-cheat measures. This is an interesting one because Steam has some decent anti-cheat options available. Firstly, studios are free to use whatever proprietary anti-cheat software they develop to ban players. They can also use third-party tech like PlayFab or Denuvo if they want. But Valve also allows devs to piggyback on Valve Anti-Cheat, or VAC, if they want. In fact, many non-Valve Steam games use VAC as their primary anti-cheat method. Games like DayZ, Rust, Ark, even several versions of Call of Duty. And you know what other game used Valve Anti-Cheat? The original Helldivers. We may never know the real reason why Sony decided to do this, but what we do know is that it was a serious enough point for them to double down on it a few days later after the initial wave of bad reviews. As it became apparent that not all countries where Helldivers 2 is sold on Steam have PSN, and as creating a PSN account in a country you do not live in is against Sony's terms of service, the game had to be taken down in a few countries. How many countries, do you ask? Was it 5 or 12? Or 177. Yeah, it was 177 countries.
According to Google, there are only 195 countries, which means it was taken down in 91% of all countries. I mean, who needs aliens and robots when you can just fuck up your planet yourself?
All the while, the negative reviews kept coming in, and while nobody was surprised that PC players were that well organized and happy to demonstrate their frustration, the sheer size and organization of the protests was genuinely impressive. Something in the realm of 150,000 negative reviews were logged on Steam in a single day, bringing the total to around 250,000 the last time I checked. So how did this end? Well, Sony eventually capitulated on May 6th, and rather incredibly, the organized player base of Helldivers 2 swapped their reviews from negative to positive. At time of recording, Helldivers 2 has a mostly positive rating on Steam again, and hopefully more of these folks will reverse their scores. And so ends one of the weirdest chapters in video game news this year. And so what are we to learn from it all? Well, for one, gamers don't have that many tools at their disposal to push back on the greed and influence of publishers and platform holders. So the tools that they do have access to, they are using. Social media, Steam reviews, Reddit. Game players care about the games they spend their time in, and many of them have little patience for being manipulated like that. This is a numbers game though, and you really need to have a lot of people by your side to make this type of meaningful difference. This is why, for example, the previous week's controversy over Stellar Blade fell on flat ears. Not just because the complaints were petty, lame, and ultimately the choice of the developers and not in fact pressure from Sony, but because this game was sold on PlayStation, the only way of organizing any pushback was to sign a petition. Ah lads, what is this? 2005? Change.org is where old people go to complain about politics, or horror fans go to lobby their favorite filmmaker to make a decapitated head popcorn bucket.
Actually, wait a second, there are a weird amount of video game related petitions on here.
Like restore original jobs and moods in the game Welcome to Bloxburg, or revert Fall Guys to its original format. Here's a petition to demand the shutdown of Kotaku. And funnily enough, the Bring Helldivers 2 to Xbox petition has a lot more votes than the Stellar Blade one. But Steam reviews are one of the few places where democratic action meets the wallets of big companies. at least with people who have already purchased the game. If you buy a game on PSN and suddenly it becomes overloaded with DLC, the most you can do is just not buy the DLC. But if it's in a Steam game, a marketplace which overwhelmingly relies on crowdsourced product reviews to sell games, then you have a genuinely powerful way of affecting the development of the game. And this got me thinking about how the ways in which games are sold is out of step with the infrastructure of player experience. 20 years ago, most games were sold like music and movies. A piece of media was created and consumers decided whether to buy it or not. Sales charts would dictate what was popular, and that would often lead to better sales. But the shelf life of these games was short, both on shelves and inside the consoles of players. These days, the most wildly played games are all live services titles. Games like PUBG, Fortnite, Minecraft, Roblox, League of Legends, Valorant, Call of Duty. While a game like World of Warcraft needs to keep its player base engaged or they'll cancel their monthly subscription, these other games live and die on engagement and a percentage of the players buying additional content. Their fealty isn't to a broad user base, but rather by satisfying a core group of power users who are more likely to spend more money on the product. Now, none of this is anything new, of course, it's been like this for a while, but what this Helldivers 2 situation has shown me is that divorced from the economic mechanisms, there's usually no way for players to exert much influence on the games they play. In this industry, more than ever, money is power, and the best collective action is that which attacks the financial root of that power. But while it could be argued that Sony were tone deaf to the needs of Helldivers 2's players, other studios are getting savvy enough to the way players might respond. Take, for instance, the recent controversy in the Escape from Tarkov community. Back in April, the developers Battlestate Games announced that a new $250 edition of the game would be the only version to get access to a new PvE mode, despite previous assurances that owners of the bumper $100 version would get access to all future DLCs. They argued that this downloadable PvE mode, which was an additional piece of content on the game, was a whole new mode and not, in fact, downloadable content. What's worse still is that the $250 edition came with obvious pay-to-win bonuses, including more space to store loot and improved skills on a new server wipe. And it also came with an item known as Mark of the Unheard, which gave multiple bonuses to players, including cash discounts in raids, a bonus to mitigate the cost of insurance, and crucially, a bonus defense reputation, which within Tarkov means AI scavs won't fire at you if you keep your distance. Serious gameplay stuff. So the player base reacted, but they were sort of reacting to two different things. And the way this all happened made me wonder if the whole PvE mode thing was pushed out as a smokescreen for the pay-to-win stuff, which was far worse. Even when the Tarkov discords went into meltdown and the developer eventually made a peace offering, it was in the form of 6 months of access to that PvE mode and priority matchmaking for purchases of the $100 pack, basically screwing all the people who had bought the $50 version of Tarkov. They were now the Tarkov equivalent of the Irish peasants in Titanic, and some of those folks are still queuing for lifeboats. Was this an honest error on the part of Battlestate? Or was this a tactical ploy to dip their toes into the pay-to-win waters as they begin to round the corner to their eventual 1.0 release? It's hard to tell. But I wonder because this is ultimately the core fear that all of us have as fans of games, that eventually player goodwill becomes a commodity that can be cashed in, that our love of a game or of its community was always a one-way street, and as we all know, breakups can be hard.
As players, there are very few options for us to raise our concerns, so it makes sense that, just like in the real world, collective action is the only real route to exerting any meaningful power. And with so few methods of exerting that power available, is it any wonder these communities explode when they do? Engaging with your community should be a two-way street, so even if you have the most passionate fans in the world, tread lightly, because that passion cuts both ways.